The universe, in all its infinite wisdom and cosmic irony, had decided that diplomacy would be conducted in a spinning metal tube hurtling through the void at precisely 17,000 kilometers per hour. Nexus Prime, because apparently someone in the Galactic Naming Committee had the creativity of a malfunctioning translation unit, served as the crown jewel of interspecies cooperation. Which was rather like calling a kindergarten food fight a cultural exchange program. But the three major powers had agreed on the terminology after only 47 years of heated debate. The Tri-Sector Alliance had emerged from what historians would later describe as the most politely violent disagreement in galactic history. On one side, the Krillian Empire strutted about with their ridiculous honor codes and an unfortunate tendency to solve diplomatic disputes through ritualized combat. Think medieval knights, but with plasma weapons and an even more inflated sense of self-importance. On another side, the Vorthak Collective approached every conversation like a mathematical equation, complete with probability matrices and logic trees that could put a quantum computer to sleep. And then there were the humans, the cosmic equivalent of that relative who shows up to family dinner uninvited, eats all the good food, and somehow makes everyone laugh despite themselves. The irony, of course, was that humans were considered the weakest link in this triangular farce. Their diplomatic record read like a catalogue of spectacular failures, each more embarrassing than the last. The Proxima incident, where Ambassador Rodriguez had allegedly fainted during a simple greeting ceremony. The Titan trade talks, where the entire human delegation had mysteriously excused themselves citing stomach problems just as negotiations reached their climax. The infamous Mars mediation, where human Representative Johnson had reportedly burst into tears when faced with a mildly stern Krillian negotiator. Commander Zephyr Blackwood stood in the observation deck of Nexus Prime, watching the swirling nebula beyond the reinforced transparasteel windows and wondering if her predecessors had been cowards, idiots, or secret geniuses playing a game so deep that even she couldn't fathom it. At 34, she possessed the kind of sharp intelligence that could cut through bureaucratic nonsense and the sort of dry wit that made even hardened space marines chuckle nervously. Her service record was impeccable, her diplomatic credentials unquestionable, and her patience with alien superiority complexes wearing thinner than atmosphere at the edge of a gravity well. The central hub of Nexus Prime resembled what would happen if a cathedral had been designed by engineers who had only heard cathedrals described through a broken translation program. Soaring arches of polished metametal rose toward a domed ceiling that displayed a real-time view of the surrounding star field, because apparently even in space, everyone still wanted skylights. The floor was a masterwork of geometric patterns that somehow managed to accommodate the walking preferences of species with anywhere from 2 to 8 legs, though the sight of a Vorthak attempting to navigate the design while maintaining their perfectly calculated stride remained one of the station's more entertaining spectacles. Today's festivities, and that term was used with all the enthusiasm of someone describing a root canal, marked the 15th anniversary of the Cultural Exchange Protocols. Which was bureaucrat speak for let's put representatives from 3 mutually suspicious civilizations in a confined space with alcohol and see what happens. The results, historically speaking, had ranged from mildly awkward to someone alert the hazmat team. Ambassador Thex'vol of the Krillian Third Battle Fleet cut through the crowd like a particularly pompous knife through particularly yielding butter. Standing nearly 7 feet tall, with a kind of bearing that suggested he had practiced looking imperious in front of a mirror every morning since childhood, he embodied everything the Krillian Empire wanted the galaxy to think about their species. His ceremonial armor, because of course he wore ceremonial armor to a diplomatic reception, gleamed with enough polish to blind a small spacecraft, and the ritual scars on his visible face and hands told stories of honor duels that had probably been less impressive in reality than in the telling. The Krillian concept of honor operated on principles that would have made ancient Klingons shake their heads in confusion. Everything was a potential slight, every interaction a possible challenge, and every diplomatic exchange an opportunity to demonstrate superiority through the time-honored tradition of being an insufferable ass. They maintained extensive databases on the weakness indicators of other species, and humans, unfortunately, rank somewhere between mildly pathetic and suitable only for janitorial duties. Commander Blackwood, Thex'vol's voice carried across the reception hall with all the warmth of interstellar space. How fortuitous to encounter you here. Zephyr turned from her conversation with the Vorthak Trade Commissioner, A being whose idea of small talk involved reciting statistical analyses of atmospheric compositions, and faced the approaching Krillian with the sort of smile that never quite reached her eyes. Ambassador. What a pleasant surprise. Indeed. Thex'vol positioned himself with the calculating precision of someone who had read too many tactical manuals and not enough books on basic social interaction. I trust your accommodations continue to meet your modest requirements. The nearby aliens suddenly found their conversations far less interesting than the potential entertainment value of watching a human squirm under Krillian condescension. Even the Vorthak began running probability calculations for various outcomes, though they had the courtesy to keep their excited chittering to a minimum volume. They are adequate, Zephyr replied, her tone carrying just enough edge to suggest that she understood perfectly well what game was being played. Though I must say, the artificial gravity in the human quarters seems to fluctuate more than in other sections. Thex'vol's laugh sounded like gravel being processed by a malfunctioning recycling unit. Perhaps your species simply lacks the stability to adapt properly to standardized environments. We have observed this weakness in previous human delegations. The word weakness hung in the air like a toxic gas leak, and every conversation within a 20-meter radius suddenly ground to a halt. This was it, the moment when the human would begin the traditional dance of diplomatic backpedaling, apologies, and face-saving retreats that had become synonymous with their species' negotiation style. Speaking of observations, Zephyr said, her voice carrying with a clarity that suggested she was either completely oblivious to the social dynamics at play or operating on a level far above them, I couldn't help but notice that Krillian ceremonial armor has what appears to be a built-in compensatory mechanism for height. Fascinating engineering, really. The silence that followed was the kind of profound quiet that usually preceded either brilliant insights or spectacular disasters. Thex'vol's expression shifted through several phases of confusion, realization, and mounting indignation, while the surrounding aliens began updating their behavioral prediction models in real time. You dare suggest, Thex'vol began, his voice rising with the kind of righteous fury that could power a small fusion reactor. Oh, I wouldn't dare suggest anything, Zephyr interrupted with a sort of innocent tone that would have made angels weep with envy. I was merely making an observation about the remarkable sophistication of Krillian technology. Surely someone of your obvious physical prowess wouldn't interpret a compliment as anything else. The beauty of the exchange lay in its perfect diplomatic construction. Every word could be defended as innocent observation or sincere compliment, yet the underlying message was clear enough to cut through hull plating. Thex'vol found himself in the uncomfortable position of being forced to either accept what was obviously mockery disguised as praise or admit that he was looking for insults where none technically existed. His response came in the form of a backhand that cracked across Zephyr's cheek with a sound like a plasma bolt striking metal. The impact was sharp, precise, and calculated to leave a mark without causing permanent damage, the kind of blow that Krillian honor codes classified as a corrective gesture rather than a formal challenge. The crack of flesh meeting flesh echoed through the reception hall with crystalline clarity, followed by a silence so complete that even the station's atmospheric processes seemed to pause in their humming. Every being present, from the insectoid Vorthak to the crystalline hegemony representatives, froze in place, their various sensory organs focused on the tableau before them. Zephyr's head snapped to the side with the force of the blow, her dark hair whipping across her face before settling back into place. A red mark bloomed across her left cheek, standing out starkly against her pale skin like a declaration of war written in bruised flesh. She stood there for a moment, perfectly still, her eyes fixed on some point beyond Thex'vol's shoulder while the crack of his slap still seemed to linger in the recycled air. This was it. This was the moment that every alien database, every probability matrix, every historical analysis predicted with mathematical certainty. The human would now demonstrate the weakness that defined their species. They would apologize, retreat, or perhaps even grovel, anything to avoid the sort of direct confrontation that their diplomatic record suggested they were psychologically incapable of handling. The Vorthak Trade Commissioner began running calculations on the statistical likelihood of various submission behaviors, while a group of crystalline observers started taking bets on whether the human would cry before or after issuing a formal apology. The Krillian honor guard, standing at attention near the hall's main entrance, exchanged glances that suggested they were already composing reports on yet another demonstration of human cowardice. Thex'vol himself stood with the satisfied bearing of someone who had just proven a point that had never really been in question. His ceremonial armor caught the overhead lighting as he straightened to his full impressive height, ready to accept whatever groveling response the human might offer. Perhaps she would claim diplomatic immunity, or invoke some obscure protocol that would allow her to withdraw gracefully. Either way, the natural order would be restored, and the galaxy could return to the comfortable certainty that humans were exactly as pathetic as everyone believed. Zephyr slowly turned her head back toward Thex'vol, her movements deliberate and controlled. Her cheek still bore the angry red mark of his strike, but her eyes held something that made several nearby aliens suddenly recalculate their assumptions about human emotional responses. She looked at the Krillian ambassador with the sort of expression that suggested she was seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time. "Well," she said, her voice carrying with perfect conversational clarity that was remarkably stupid. The words hung in the air for precisely 0.847 seconds, a time frame that would later be confirmed by multiple Vorthak observers who had been recording the entire exchange for their behavioral analysis databases. Then Zephyr's right fist connected with Thex'vol's jaw with a sound like a meteor impacting an asteroid. The physics of the impact were, from a purely scientific perspective, quite fascinating. Zephyr's punch carried all the mechanical advantage of proper form, the kinetic energy of controlled fury, and the surprising force that came from muscles conditioned by a lifetime spent in variable gravity environments. Thex'vol, for his part, had been standing in a posture optimized for looking imposing rather than absorbing sudden applications of blunt force trauma. The result was a demonstration in applied physics that would have been educational if it hadn't been quite so spectacular. The 7-foot Krillian warrior, resplendent in his ceremonial armor and radiating the confidence of a species that had never seriously considered the possibility that a human might punch back, toppled backward like a felled tree. His arms windmilled frantically as he fought against gravity and failed, his polished armor clattering against the geometric floor patterns with a sound like a percussion section falling downstairs. He landed with a sort of resonant crash that made the entire station seem to vibrate sympathetically, his ceremonial helm rolling away across the decorative floor tiles with a metallic ringing that somehow managed to sound almost musical. For a moment, he lay there in a sprawl of limbs and dented armor, staring up at the artificial sky display with the expression of someone whose entire worldview had just been subjected to percussive maintenance. The silence that followed was deeper than the space between galaxies. Every being in the reception hall, from the most analytical Vorthak to the most emotion-driven crystalline entity, stood frozen in place, their various cognitive processes grinding through the implications of what they had just witnessed. Somewhere in the background, an atmospheric recycler continued its mechanical humming, apparently the only system on the station still functioning normally. Zephyr stood over the fallen ambassador, flexing the fingers of her right hand with the casual air of someone checking to make sure all the important parts were still attached and functional. Her cheek still bore the mark of Thex'vol's slap, but her expression suggested that she considered the exchange of blows to be fairly concluded, at least from an accounting perspective. "You know," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the stunned silence, "your databases really should include a footnote about human diplomatic strategy." She looked down at Thex'vol, who was still attempting to process the fact that he was viewing the conversation from a horizontal perspective. "We call it speak softly and carry a big stick. Though in this case, I suppose my fist qualified as adequate stick replacement." The Krillian honor guard, who had been trained to respond to threats against their diplomatic corps with swift and overwhelming force, found themselves in the unprecedented situation of trying to determine whether they should arrest the human or offer her a position in their military hierarchy. Their entire tactical doctrine was based on the assumption that humans would either run away or surrender when faced with superior Krillian might, and their instruction manuals contained no protocols for dealing with humans who punched their superiors into decorative floor patterns. Thex'vol finally managed to prop himself up on his elbows, his ceremonial armor now bearing several impressive dents that would probably require explanation in his official reports. He stared up at Zephyr with the expression of someone whose fundamental understanding of the universe had just been forcibly recalibrated. You struck me," he said, his voice carrying a note of wonder that suggested he was still processing the basic facts of the situation. Yes, Zephyr agreed with the patience of someone explaining basic mathematics to a particularly slow child. That tends to happen when you hit someone who hits back. It's one of those cause and effect relationships that most species figure out fairly early in their development. Around the reception hall, aliens began frantically updating their species databases, recalculating threat assessments, and generally coming to terms with the realization that their assumptions about human nature might require some revision. The Vorthak Trade Commissioner was generating so many new probability matrices that his translation unit was smoking, while the crystalline observers had abandoned their betting pool in favor of what appeared to be a theological crisis about the nature of assumed universal constants. One of the younger Krillian honor guards approached cautiously, his weapon held in a position that suggested he wasn't entirely sure who he should be pointing it at. "Ambassador," he said, his voice carrying the careful tone of someone trying not to accidentally start an interstellar incident. Should we arrest the human?" Thex'vol looked up from his position on the floor, then at Zephyr, then back at his confused subordinate. Something shifted in his expression, a kind of recognition that suggested he was beginning to understand that the situation had moved far beyond the scope of normal diplomatic protocols. "No," he said slowly, still staring at Zephyr with what might have been the beginning of something approaching respect. "No, I think we may have misunderstood something fundamental about our human colleagues." He struggled to his feet with the careful movements of someone whose dignity had taken more damage than his armor, though that was saying something. When he finally stood upright, somewhat less imposingly than before, given the new dents in his ceremonial gear, he faced Zephyr with an expression that suggested he was seeing her species in an entirely new light. "Commander Blackwood," he said, his tone carrying none of its previous condescension, "I believe I owe you an apology. And perhaps an explanation." Zephyr raised an eyebrow, her expression suggesting mild interest rather than triumph. "An explanation would be refreshing. Though I'm curious about which part needs explaining, the part where you thought hitting me was appropriate, or the part where you assumed I wouldn't hit back." "Both, actually." Thex'vol attempted to straighten his armor, succeeded only in making the dents more symmetrical, and gave up with the air of someone who had finally learned to prioritize substance over appearance. "We have been operating under certain assumptions about human diplomatic capabilities. Assumptions that now appear to have been based on incomplete data." "Incomplete data," Zephyr repeated, her voice carrying just enough dryness to dehydrate a small desert. "Is that what we're calling it?" Around them, the other aliens began to cautiously resume their conversations, though the volume remained conspicuously lower than before, and the content seemed to revolve entirely around re-evaluating everything they thought they knew about human behavioral patterns. Several Vorthak had produced recording devices and were documenting the exchange with the sort of intense focus usually reserved for discovering new mathematical principles. "Commander," said a voice from the crowd, and Zephyr turned to see Captain Morris Chen of the merchant vessel Wandering Star approaching with the careful steps of someone navigating a potential minefield. Chen was one of the few humans who had witnessed the entire exchange, and his expression suggested he was still processing the implications himself. "Captain Chen," Zephyr acknowledged with a nod that somehow managed to convey both professional courtesy and a subtle warning about saying too much. "That was..." Chen began, then stopped, apparently running through several possible ways to complete the sentence and finding them all inadequate. "That was not what I expected from today's reception." "Expectations," Zephyr said with the sort of philosophical air that suggested she had given the subject considerable thought, "are often based on incomplete information. Sometimes they need to be recalibrated." She looked around the reception hall, taking in the sight of aliens frantically updating their databases, Krillian honor guards trying to figure out new protocols, and one particularly confused Vorthak who appeared to be having an existential crisis about the reliability of statistical predictions. Her gaze finally settled back on Thex'vol, who was still attempting to process his new understanding of human diplomatic strategy. "You know," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the hall, "there's something I think you should understand about human diplomatic failures. About all those embarrassing incidents that made such interesting reading in your species databases." The ambient noise level dropped as every being within hearing range focused their attention on her words. Even the crystalline observers, who didn't technically have ears, somehow managed to convey intense listening through their prismatic forms. Ambassador Rodriguez didn't faint during the Proxima incident. Zephyr continued with the casual tone of someone sharing mildly interesting trivia. He was buying time for our negotiation team to crack the encryption on the hegemony's private communications. The stomach problems during the Titan trade talks? Our entire delegation was actually in emergency session, finalizing counterproposals based on intelligence we'd gathered about the other party's real positions. And Representative Johnson's tears during the Mars mediation weren't from fear, they were from trying not to laugh at how badly the Vrex consortium was overplaying their hand. The silence that greeted this revelation was different from the previous shocked silences. This was the quiet of multiple species simultaneously realizing that they had been playing chess while assuming their opponent was playing checkers, only to discover that the humans had been playing three-dimensional chess while everyone else was still figuring out how the pieces moved. "You're saying," Thex'vol said slowly, his voice carrying the careful tone of someone afraid to trust what he was hearing, that human diplomatic weakness was intentional. Zephyr's smile had all the warmth of a fusion reactor core, and twice the potential for explosive results. "Let me put it this way, Ambassador. When your opponent consistently underestimates your capabilities, why would you go out of your way to correct their misconceptions?" The implications hit the assembled aliens like a wave front from a stellar explosion. Every diplomatic failure, every embarrassing retreat, every moment of apparent human cowardice suddenly took on a different cast when viewed through the lens of deliberate misdirection. The humans hadn't been failing at diplomacy, they had been succeeding so completely that their success had been mistaken for incompetence. A Vorthak observer near the hall's edge began laughing, a sound like crystalline wind chimes being played by a hurricane. "The probability matrices," he said between bursts of what passed for Vorthak mirth, "we've been calculating human behavior based on the assumption that they were trying to succeed at conventional diplomacy. But they were succeeding at something entirely different." "Strategic deception," another alien voice added, and Zephyr couldn't identify the speaker through the crowd. "They made weakness into strength by making their strength appear to be weakness." "Very philosophical," Zephyr agreed, "though I prefer to think of it as practical. When you're the new species in a galaxy full of established powers, it pays to let everyone assume you're harmless until you're in a position where being harmless is no longer necessary." She looked around the reception hall one more time, taking in the sight of three major galactic powers simultaneously recalibrating their understanding of human nature, human capabilities, and human intentions. The Krillians were struggling with the concept that their honor-based assumptions about strength and weakness might not apply to a species that treated honor as a tactical consideration rather than a defining characteristic. The Vorthak were discovering that their logical analyses had been based on deliberately falsified data, which was causing them to question the reliability of logic itself. And the various minor powers were beginning to realize that the weak human federation might actually be the most dangerous player in the galactic political arena. "Well," she said, flexing her right hand one more time and noting with satisfaction that all the important joints still worked properly, "I think this reception has been remarkably educational for everyone involved." Thex'vol, who had finally managed to remove his damaged ceremonial helm and was now holding it like a metallic reminder of his previous misconceptions, nodded slowly. "Commander, I believe we need to begin our diplomatic relationship from an entirely different foundation." "I agree," Zephyr said with the sort of cheerful tone that somehow managed to be more threatening than any formal declaration of hostilities. "Though I should point out that this foundation begins with the understanding that hitting people tends to result in getting hit back. It's one of those universal constants that seems to transcend species boundaries." The reception continued for another 2 hours, though the character of the conversations had shifted dramatically. Where before the humans had been politely ignored or condescendingly addressed, they now found themselves the center of intense and respectful attention. Trade deals that had been stalled for months suddenly found new momentum. Military cooperation agreements that had been dismissed as unnecessary were hastily reconsidered. And in the darker corners of the station, several species began quietly reviewing their intelligence assessments of human industrial capacity, military capabilities, and strategic intentions. As the evening wound down and the various delegates began returning to their quarters, Zephyr found herself standing once again at the observation deck windows, watching the nebula swirl through its eternal dance of creation and destruction. The mark on her cheek had faded to a barely visible pink line, but she suspected that the impact of the evening's events would take much longer to dissipate. Captain Chen approached from behind, his footsteps echoing softly in the now quiet corridor. "Commander," he said, his voice carrying a note of something that might have been admiration, that was either the most brilliant piece of diplomatic theater I've ever witnessed, or the most spectacular way to start an interstellar war. Zephyr turned from the window with a smile that suggested she found both possibilities equally entertaining. "Captain, I'm curious about something. When you read the reports about all those previous diplomatic failures, all those embarrassing human retreats and submissions, what did you think?" Chen considered the question for a moment. "Honestly, I thought we were terrible at this whole diplomacy thing. I figured we were lucky the galaxy tolerated us at all. And now I'm wondering if we've been playing a game so sophisticated that even our own people didn't understand the rules." He paused, looking out at the stars. "Were you improvising back there, or was this all part of some larger strategy?" Zephyr's laugh carried the sort of genuine amusement that suggested the question had touched on something particularly funny. "Captain, the beautiful thing about strategic ambiguity is that even I'm not entirely sure where the planning ended and the improvisation began. But I will say this, when Thex'vol slapped me, he made the tactical error of assuming I would respond according to his species' database on human behavioral patterns. And instead, I responded according to human behavioral patterns that haven't made it into any database yet." She turned back to the window, her reflection ghostly in the transparent steel. The universe is full of species that think they understand strength and weakness, honor and cowardice, victory and defeat. Most of them define these concepts in fairly predictable ways. And humans define them in whatever way happens to be most useful at the time. She touched the fading mark on her cheek thoughtfully. "The crack of his slap is still lingering in the diplomatic records that every species will file tonight. But my fist silenced not just one fight, but the entire conversation about human weakness that's been going on for decades." Chen nodded slowly, beginning to understand the full scope of what had transpired. "So now, instead of being dismissed as harmless, we're an unknown quantity," Zephyr finished. "Which, from a strategic perspective, is far more valuable than being either loved or feared. Unknown quantities have to be taken seriously. They can't be safely ignored or easily predicted. They require careful consideration and respectful treatment." The observation deck fell into a comfortable silence as both humans contemplated the view beyond the station. Somewhere in the distance, a transport ship was accelerating toward a jump point, its engines painting streaks of blue-white fire across the star field. The universe continued its ancient dance of physics and probability, apparently unconcerned with the small political dramas played out by the organic intelligences that had somehow learned to think and argue and occasionally punch each other in the face. "You know," Chen said after a while, "I'm starting to think that human diplomatic strategy might be more sophisticated than anyone realized, including humans." Zephyr smiled, and this time the expression reached her eyes. "Captain, the galaxy spent so much time analyzing our failures that they forgot to consider the possibility that we might be succeeding at something entirely different. Tonight, Ambassador Thex'vol learned that lesson the hard way. And tomorrow, every species in the galaxy will wake up with a new appreciation for the dangers of underestimating humans. They'll revise their databases, update their threat assessments, and recalibrate their diplomatic approaches." She paused, her smile taking on a particularly satisfied quality. "And they'll do it all while wondering what other assumptions they've made that might be equally wrong." The universe, in all its infinite wisdom and cosmic irony, continued spinning through the void. But in one small corner of space, on a station where three major powers had come together to practice the art of civilized discourse, the balance of diplomatic power had shifted in the space between a slap and the answering punch that silenced not just one Krillian ambassador, but an entire galaxy's misconceptions about human nature. The crack of his slap was still lingering in the station's atmospheric processes, but her fist had silenced the fight, and in doing so, had started an entirely different kind of conversation about what it meant to be human in a universe full of aliens who thought they had all the answers. It was, Zephyr reflected as she watched the stars wheel through their eternal patterns, a pretty good day for diplomacy after all.